I don't think an adult could have written this book. All of those sharp edges in this book that are kind of, I think, a result of the author's age are what make it great. I think an adult would have written a more polished version of this, a more kind of competent, I guess, but it would have lacked the soul. Welcome to Shoulda Books, the podcast about all the books you should have read by now. My name is Jonathan, and today we are talking about the 1967 young adult classic, The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. And I am joined here in the abandoned fire hazard of a church by myself. This is a solo episode, but I'm also joined here digitally by one of our lovely patrons, Solveig, shout out Solveig, and also by friend of the show, Kaylin Hertz, who saw the musical on Broadway and had a lot of thoughts about it. So she sent in a message. I am really excited to talk about this book. As I was prepping for this episode, I was going back and rereading passages and I was tearing up a little bit. So it's very possible that is going to happen today. I don't know. But if the tears come, I'm not going to stop them, but I might edit them out. Who knows? So it goes without saying, there's going to be a lot of spoilers for this episode. So if you haven't read the book, you have been warned. All right, shall we get into it? You know what that means. Obviously, synopsis voice. Let's go. Published in 1967 when the author was still just a teenager herself, S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders follows a group of working-class boys known as greasers in their perennial battle with the preppy kids known as socias, which is pronounced that way instead of socks, even though socks would be more fun. The tale is told through the eyes of Pony Boy Curtis, a 14-year-old greaser who lives with his two older brothers, Derry and Soda Pop, after the recent deaths of their parents. Pony Boy doesn't want to fight, he wants to read and watch sunsets, honestly same, but one night, the violence escalates and Pony Boy must face the consequences of his and his friends' actions, and more importantly, the reality of growing up. This is The Outsiders, and apologies for hitting the mic, I'm leaving it in. I really enjoyed this book. I thought that when I started it, I was like, oh boy, this is going to be... I'm in for a long ride. You know, it's written in honestly kind of a childish way, but that makes sense because the author was a teenager herself. She started this when she was 15. She finished it when she was 16. It was published when she was 18. So the whole experience is just those incredibly formative years. I am blown away that a teenager was able to write a story like this. Like I just am. Like, you know, I wrote stories when I was that age. I wrote in my mind, it's a 400-page novel. I do think that the font and spacing size had something to do with that. So I don't know what the word count was, but I wrote what I refer to as a 400-page novel when I was 14 to 15. That was the combine of my two great loves at the time, which were Indiana Jones and Lord of the Rings. It was this fantasy story called The White Blade, and I think it's lost to time. It might exist somewhere in my parents' house on a floppy disk, because I wrote it on a Windows 98 Hewlett-Packard. Anyway, that's not what this Proustian reverie is not what the episode is about. The reason I bring all this up is just that, like, I think back to what I wrote when I was that age, and it was not nearly as good as this freaking book. And as jealous as I might be, I will put that aside and talk about this book because she captures what it's like to be a teenager in a way that just, it kind of took my breath away. Like, as I just said, mentioning floppy disks, I haven't been a teenager for some time. And in fact, a while. And this book really kind of brought me back there. She captures like how when you're that age, all you want to be is older. All you want to be is you want to, like, whatever your circumstances are, you're like, I can't wait to get on to the next thing. But then you spend the rest of your life like trying to get back there. When adults write about being a teenager, they can't help but write about it through the lens of nostalgia. a nostalgia that generally sands off the rough edges and that paints everything in a more rose-tinted light, where the hurts are, they're comfortable because they're a pain that you've known for years, and so you know how to feel about it, you know how to talk about it. When it's actually happening to you, you have no way to process it, and that's, I'm painting with a broad brush here. Obviously, we all still have things that happened to us when we were kids that we haven't processed fully, and that we'll spend the rest of our lives processing fully. I'll speak for myself on that front, but it's really hard to recapture what it's like when you're actually in those, for lack of a better term, trenches. And S.E. Hinton was in those trenches when she wrote this. So the inspiration for this book was that one of her friends got jumped, much the same way that Johnny was jumped, and then Ponyboy in the intro. And she started writing about it. So she wasn't necessarily a greaser who was going to rumbles and things like that, but she was had a front row seat to that. And I just was really blown away by the emotional depth that she included in this story, because she's, like I said, she's in the moment, she's experiencing these things, but she has a wisdom that I think is so rare, that is able to kind of transcend. And there's so much pathos in this story. There's so much just humanity to it that I really loved. Now, the book obviously is not without its flaws. We're going to get into some of those, but overall, I really enjoyed it. And we're going to get into the specifics of the book and the story and the narrative and the themes and all those lovely things. But first, let's listen to a voicemail from listener Solveig.
Hello, Jonathan and Shoulda crew. Hope all is well. My name is Solveig, and here are my thoughts on The Outsiders. So when I first started reading this, I asked my partner if he'd read this book, and he said that he read it and watched the movie. So basically, I was live texting him all of my thoughts and reactions as I was reading it. And I said to him, "Oh, is this West Side Story?" "Yeah, this is just West Side Story." And he said, yeah, but the only flavors available are vanilla and sugar-free vanilla. And I just thought that was so funny and made me laugh and is so accurate. But all jokes aside, what an incredible feat to write a coherent novel at such a young age. Mm-hmm. I admire the exploration of difficult topics while also not romanticizing the events and the culture. I think it brings just more reality, kind of gloom and doom to this kind of notion of gang culture and all that sort of stuff. So I really appreciated that. So those are my thoughts.
Well, thank you so much, Solveig. Yeah, vanilla and sugar-free vanilla is a great way to describe it. That, the lack of diversity in the story, is certainly one of the flaws. We'll get into that in a little bit. But yeah, it definitely is very, very similar to West Side Story. I was thinking about that as I was reading it. As I was researching it, I didn't find any quotes from S.E. Hinton claiming that was an inspiration. Doesn't mean she didn't say that somewhere. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. But I didn't see any direct evidence. The movie, so the movie of West Side Story came out in 1961. The original Broadway play was 1957. She grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I don't know if, she would have seen a re-release because, in 1961 she would have been a kid. I don't know. Maybe she went. Maybe she went when she was a wee child. I guess she wouldn't have been that. I'm bad at math. We've established this. So let's go ahead and say she probably saw West Side Story. She maybe also saw Rebel Without a Cause. That's certainly another movie that is brought up a lot in conversation with this. regardless, though, she was still pulling a lot from her own lived experience and witnessed experience in high school. West Side Story is great, though. So thank you, Solveig, and your partner for that wonderful voicemail. So let's get into the characters of The Outsiders. So obviously, narrating all of this, we got Pony Boy Curtis. I love the detail that the Curtis boys have like weird names. You've got Daryl, the firstborn, pretty normal name. He goes by Derry. And then, the parents are just like, okay, look, what if we did a silly one? And so the middle child is Soda Pop. That's his legal given name. And then rounding out the crew, last but not least, is Pony Boy Curtis. Again, his real legal name. Such a funny little detail. I don't necessarily know what sort of symbolism is being given there, other than just a touch of whimsy. But anyway, we've got Pony Boy. He's our narrator. He's 14, and he sounds like a 14-year-old. Again, when I started this book, I was like, oh boy, this narration is tough. It sounds like a kid trying to be tough, and that's exactly what it is. He is someone who is trying to be more rough and tumble than he actually is, because at the end of the day, he's a sensitive lad. He loves watching sunsets. He likes getting good grades. He likes reading. He runs track, which is hilariously not revealed until like the very end. It's like, oh, also, by the way, I run track. I'm really fast, which feels again like something that a more experienced writer would not have left for the end. It's hard to not kind of keep bringing it all back to the author's age, I'm realizing. And it begs the question, would this book be as interesting if we didn't know that the author was a teenager? I'm not sure. It's hard to separate it. But the reality is that is part of the narrative. And for better or worse, that is part of why we love this book. But I think it also is inseparable in that, like, I don't think an adult could have written this book. I just don't think all of those sharp edges in this book that are kind of, I think, a result of the author's age are what make it great. And so I don't think that an adult would have written a more polished version of this. A more kind of competent, I guess, but it would have lacked the soul. It wouldn't have felt the same. And so, and we probably would not be talking about it close to 60 years later. Yeah, I guess next year will be the 60th anniversary of this. Anyway, back to good old Pony Boy. The first sentence of this book: when I stepped out into the bright sunlight from the darkness of the movie house, I had only two things on my mind: Paul Newman and a ride home. And from there, we are dropped into the action. Pony Boy is a greaser, and he's walking home. He gets jumped by some Socs, and they beat him up. And this book obviously is about like class warfare. You've got the greasers, who are the working class kids, and then you've got the Socs, which it bothers me. The name Soch. I know they're the bad guys, so maybe that's the point, but I just don't like the way it sounds. Anyway, the Socs are the upper class, or I guess maybe upper middle class. The like truly upper class probably go to private and boarding schools, whatever. Anyway, it's the haves versus the have-nots. Obviously, to tie it back to what Solveig's partner so wonderfully described. These are all white kids. This was written in, it was published in 1967, written a couple years before that. So in the height of the 60s, Tulsa, Oklahoma, famously a racist, segregated city. It was the home of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. It had Jim Crow laws. I don't know what S.E. Hinton's views are. She really doesn't give a whole lot of interviews. There's certainly not, any speaking characters who are not vanilla or sugar-free vanilla. The speaking characters that we do have are mostly all on the greaser side. You've got Ponyboy, his two brothers we talked about, and then the rest kind of the cast. You've got Dallas, who goes by Dally, which I will point out that having a character named Dally, Dally, and a character named Darry, Darry, too similar. Okay, it's when you're reading, especially when you're reading as fast as old Johnny Kirk, which is not very fast. It gets confusing to see the character. So there was a lot of times where I was having to stop and be like, when they were in scenes together, be like, wait, who said what? But Dallas is he's the baddest boy of them all. He's the one who's like, does the real like illegal stuff and has a gun and is kind of the most obnoxious in a way. You've got 2-Bit, who's the funny one, which like, was he really that funny? I don't know. I guess humor changes over time. And then you got Soda Pop's friend Steve, which, man, fuck Steve. Steve is he's so annoying. Didn't care for him. And then of course we've got Johnny. Johnny's kind of, the heart and soul of the book. He is, kind of the most timid and what is presented as the weakest of the gang. Yeah, when God, you can't help but feel for Johnny. I mean, his home life is just shit. He is, it sounds like certainly verbally abused, probably physically abused, certainly neglected. There's some heavy stuff going on in these kids' lives. Before the story begins, Johnny has been beat up. He's been brutally beaten by the Socs, and he just really hasn't been the same since. And so he and Ponyboy are very close. They're both the youngest in the group. Ponyboy's dealing with his own stuff too. His parents died relatively recently in a car wreck, and so he is living with his two brothers who are kind of his caretakers, especially Darry, the oldest, who's 20, I believe, is working like crazy to kind of keep a roof over their heads. And he's had to grow up. He has had to become an adult with real capital R responsibilities before any of the other boys have. And Ponyboy and Darry are butting heads a lot because Darry is now kind of assuming the mantle of guardian, of parent, really. And Ponyboy's like, hey, get off my case, man. Why are you so hard on me all the time? And so one night, Ponyboy and Darry get into a spat, and Darry slaps him. Darry is, horrified at himself and tries to apologize, but Ponyboy runs off and meets up with Johnny. And he and Johnny are out in the middle of the night, and they get cornered by some Socs, including the Socs who beat the shit out of Johnny earlier. Johnny is like, this isn't happening again. So the Socs are beating up on Ponyboy. They're trying to drown him in a fountain. And then next thing you know, Ponyboy kind of comes to and realizes that Johnny has stabbed and killed one of the Socs. And so that's really kind of the inciting incident. So from there, Johnny and Ponyboy are on the run, and they go hide out in this church that Dally told them about. And when they're in the church, that's when we get the recitation of the Robert Frost poem, "Nothing Gold Can Stay." And this kind of, this is the thing that people remember from the story is the "Stay Gold." "Stay Gold, Ponyboy." It comes from this poem, and this poem is about how glory fades, sic transit gloria. Nothing gold can stay. Anything that's great in life is impermanent, and it's the sort of thing that you really kind of start thinking about for the first time when you're this age. You start to realize that like your mortality is a thing. You start to realize that you can be disappointed that the things you want to have happen aren't necessarily going to happen. It's the disillusionment. That's part of what growing up is, and that is what this book is kind of reckoning with, is that like disillusionment. One thing that I really loved about Ponyboy's arc and the way that it was portrayed, so this is a story about Ponyboy kind of coming of age, really. And the first night we meet him, when he leaves the movie theater and thinking about Paul Newman, he gets jumped by the Socs, he gets beaten up. At the end of the story, he is out with the boys and some Socs pull up. He takes a bottle, he breaks it, he holds it up as a weapon. They back off. And once they backed off, he cleans up the glass, which is just, it's such a perfect image of like, he has grown, he's hardened, you know, he's someone who now he's not going to back down from a fight. He's going to stand up for himself, but he also hasn't lost his sensitivity. You know, he's still someone who cares about other people. The reason he's like, I cleaned up the glass because I didn't want anyone to get a flat tire, you know? And so I just think that like, it's such a beautiful little button of like showing where our character started and where he ends up. I really loved, you know, this cast. I loved the way that it showed friendship, especially friendship at that age, where like it's not based on a whole lot more than just like proximity and, you know, and a general affinity. And it's just like, these are my people. These are my people. You know, it's the found family trope for sure. And I think it's done really well. The dynamic with the brothers is also just brilliant. I mean, the way that like Derry is portrayed is so nuanced, you know, in that like you understand where he's coming from, and you understand, and Ponyboy grows to understand where he's coming from. You know, he grows to see the nuance of like, no, Derry does love me. He loves me deeply and fiercely. It's just, you know, he struggles to articulate that sometimes, and he's also under just an insane amount of pressure because, you know, what's kind of looming over these boys is the idea of foster homes, you know, that basically like if things go bad, the state is going to intervene and it's going to split them up and they won't be together, you know. See, I said I was maybe going to tear up. I started to tear up a little bit. So, yeah, just, you know, the idea of them splitting up is kind of the worst thing that could happen. And they all don't want that to happen, and they're all doing what they can, you know, but Ponyboy doesn't necessarily realize any of this at the beginning, you know. It's not till he goes through all this that he realizes just how much his oldest brother loves him. But what I really love as a middle child myself is the way that Soda Pop is portrayed as a middle child, where he is literally in the middle, and he, you know, he has his own moment of kind of breaking when you know, so when Ponyboy wants him to like choose sides, and he's like, I can't choose a side, you know. And I just thought, man, that you got that right too. So, yeah, the way that the family is portrayed, I thought was really beautiful and just incredibly well observed. So good on ya, S.E., which stands for Susan Eloise. Her real name's Susan Eloise Hinton. She went by her initials because her publisher said that she should, so that male reviewers would not dismiss her. That's, you know, that's mid-century America for you. Well, I guess probably all century America. Okay, so also on the Socs side, we have the two female characters that have a shall we call it a speaking role in this book, are Marcia and Cherry. And the Cherry storyline, so, you know, Ponyboy meets them at the movies, and it seems like maybe there's a bit of a romance blossoming between Ponyboy and Cherry. And but Cherry is dating Bob Sheldon, one of the Socs. He's the one who ends up dying. He's the one that Johnny ends up killing. The Cherry storyline was interesting. I felt like it didn't end up going anywhere. That was just kind of how I felt about it. Like, it felt like we were kind of getting this Romeo and Juliet, you know, call back to West Side Story, storyline that was getting set up, and then it didn't end up happening, which, you know, maybe is a good thing. It's a subversion of expectations, because I certainly expected that to be where this was heading. And if it had, maybe it would have been too much like West Side Story. So maybe it's for the best that it didn't end up being a love story, but I was kind of pulling. I was pulling for Cherry and Ponyboy to get together. But, maybe they do in future novels. I know that S.E. Hinton wrote several novels that were kind of in this like cinematic universe that, recycle some of the characters. I don't know if I'll go and read those. But I'm curious if anyone has and or seen any of the movies that were based on those. I'm curious to find out what happens with these characters after this story. So I'm curious if the movie, does anything different with that storyline, because movies love to do different things with storylines, and I haven't seen the movie yet. I'm really excited to. I'm so excited, in fact, that it is going to be the next episode of Shoulda Films. So the April episode of Shoulda Films, that's the monthly bonus show where I watch a movie that is based on a book, is going to be The Outsiders, directed by Francis Ford Coppola and starring the famous people. Like the cast is like incredibly stacked. It's got Patrick Swayze, Rob Lowe, a young Tom Cruise. If you want to see that episode, sign up for the Patreon on the Professor tier. That's one of the benefits. You'll be able to watch that. You'll also be able to watch the previous episodes, which are the Wuthering Heights episode that I did with Joyce Louis-Jean, and the Jane Eyre episode that I did with Jack McGill. If you don't want to sign up for the Patreon, honestly, for any of the posts, you can buy them a la carte. So if there's a specific episode, you're like, oh man, I really do want to see the discussion about the movie of The Outsiders, but I don't want to, or don't feel like I am in the place to sign up for a monthly Patreon thing, don't worry about it. All the posts, you can get them for $3. So you can do it a la carte. And that money just helps me keep making this podcast. So I'm hugely thankful and humbled by everyone who has contributed to the Patreon. And I love making this show, and the Patreon helps me keep making it. So stay tuned for that. I'm also curious, speaking of adaptations, about the musical. I really want to see the Broadway adaptation of this. And friend of the show, former guest Kaylin Hertz, saw the Broadway version of this, and she has some thoughts. So let's listen to that.
Hello, Jonathan and Shoulda Bookers. I'm making that the fandom name, I've decided.
Let's go.
I went to New York and I saw The Outsiders musical, and it was so amazing. I went in completely blind. I had never read the book, still haven't. I have since then seen the movie, which I hear is a little bit more accurate to the book, but I will be talking about the musical. So the entire stage is covered in gravel. So when they're dancing and stuff, the gravel's like flying all over you if you're in the first few rows. There's the lighting design and sound design is just so amazing. All the songs are amazing. It really is so good at bringing you into that world. Story-wise, I just was so blown away. I didn't really know at all what to expect, and I was absolutely sobbing the entire second act. This, Jonathan, I'm sorry, this might be a little bit over 2 minutes. Please feel free to edit me down in any way you wish. I absolutely was just a blubbering mess by the end. I really loved how much they went into Ponyboy's grief and how he was handling that, and how that also affected the people around him. As somebody that lost a friend around the same age that Ponyboy is in the story, it was, I don't know, it really hit close to home, and I really was able to really empathize with him and understand all of his actions and motives throughout the story. I loved the character of Cherry. I will say I don't know, she kind of confused me, which I guess is probably the point of her, but she annoyed me and I also loved her at the same time. The only thing I remember when I was watching it, the only part that I was confused in the story was, I guess I'm assuming this is I can spoil.
Oh yes.
Went from them, being in this church, they obviously saved the kids. And then there's a song that's called Hoods Turned Heroes. Great song. That just kind of talks about how, they're in the front page because they saved these kids. And then it kind of just never talks about how they get out of murder. Like they don't really cover, like, is it literally that they just, they saved kids, so then it was like, okay, it's fine that you murdered someone, which, by the way, was so self-defense. Like, they should have just whatever. Anyways.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah, so I would say, like, story-wise, that's the only part that confused me. The rest, not even confused me. I was kind of just like, oh, okay, that felt like a plot hole kind of in the musical. Otherwise, though, so seamless. Everything flowed together so well. I absolutely lost it at Dallas's death. I don't think this is how it is in the book or the movie, but Dallas is played by a Black actor, and I feel like that really, like, brought a lot of depth to that storyline. He dies in the musical by basically running in front of a train, which is dark, and it also kind of calls back to the way the Curtis boys' parents died, which I thought was really horrible. And the Rumble, absolutely amazing scene lighting-wise and stuff. Yeah, I also loved the character of Derry, the older brother. He has a really good song called Throwing in the Towel that is just, like, really emotional, and you can, like, just feel how hard he's working. And it's like he's still so young also. And yeah, it just is all tied together so beautifully, and I absolutely loved it. Jonathan, I'm so sorry this was over time, but I tried so many times to make it shorter. It's just too good. I had to keep going.
Well, I can certainly relate to that feeling of, not being able to get all your thoughts in the allotted time, because I'm running into that with this episode. But I realize, I could talk about this for hours. First of all, Kaylin, thank you for sending that. So a couple things. Well, first of all, it sounds amazing. The musical sounds absolutely fantastic. I have to check it out. I don't want to sit on the front row. The idea of getting pelted with gravel while watching a play that I, presumably paid a lot of money to see sounds absolutely horrible. I'm shocked that they do that, but maybe it works. Also, I feel like those poor actors, like, are they just, like, getting scuffed and scraped every night? Because I imagine they're probably falling on the gravel. Anyway, I'm kind of stuck on the gravel. I need to know more about the gravel. But in terms of the Dally character, I think that's really interesting that, he's being portrayed by a Black actor. In the book, the way he dies is suicide by cop. He robs a liquor store and then gets the police to shoot him, basically, which is also incredibly dark. And would have been if they had chose to have him still be portrayed by a Black actor and have him still die in that way, could have been an even bigger statement. And I guess they chose not to do that. So I'm interested to see if there's any other kind of statements that they make about race, given that there's really none in the book. I assume probably not in the movie as well. I've heard that the movie is just almost like a one-to-one. S.E. Hinton was involved with writing the screenplay, and she spoke very highly of Francis Ford Coppola and said it was, he adapted 2 of her books. To answer Kaylin's other point about how the boys are kind of exonerated, Ponyboy is there is a scene in the courtroom where Ponyboy is exonerated in the book. It's they really breeze through it, and kind of Ponyboy talks about how it's kind of underwhelming. He's like, well, I thought it was going to be like, like an episode of Perry Mason, but it was actually pretty cut and dry and boring. So it's just how a lot of legal things go. So another point towards the realism of the book. But the musical, yeah, I've heard nothing but good things. I want to check it out, but I don't want to get a piece of gravel in my eye. So like I said, this book, I realized that I really could just kind of keep going on and on about it. And I really want to. The last thing I want to talk about is, I think kind of plays into kind of what this podcast is all about, which is literacy and books in general and things related to publishing. And that is how this book is one of the driving forces that created the YA genre. So when this book was originally published in 1967, it was marketed as like a drugstore novel. So, there would be these wire racks and there would be kind of these like pulpy stories marketed towards adults at the checkouts in drugstores. And it flopped. Did not do well at all. But where it did do well was in selling to libraries and classrooms. And so the publisher realized, wait a second, young people are the ones who really like this story. What if we market it towards young people? When they did that, it took off. It has sold, I think, 10 million copies as of now. The success of it really showed that there was a market for stories about, by, and for young people. And so the current, the boom of YA can really trace its roots back to this book. And S.E. Hinton, like I said, she's kind of reclusive. She doesn't do a whole lot of press, especially these days. She is still alive. She still evidently lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She's done a handful of interviews over the years. One of the most fun things that I learned about her is that she's a fan of fan fiction and that she's actually written some fan fiction herself. So she's a huge fan of the CW show Supernatural. I've seen a couple episodes of it. It is not my thing, but I know some people really love it. And she's written a couple fan fiction stories of that. Never in her name. I wasn't able to track down these stories, but maybe you can. And if you do, please report back. I'd love to hear about it. She's also written some fan fiction for The Outsiders. So she wrote some like stories within the universe just to see how people would react. And people were like, wow, you really get these characters. Because again, she's not using her real name. And she's like, okay, well, that's good. I would hope that I understand these characters. But that is going to do it for The Outsiders. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone over on Fable. It seemed to be a hit this month. People really enjoyed it. If you want to follow along with the books we're reading each month, you can do so over on Fable. In April, we're reading Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. To everyone watching and listening, thank you for watching and for listening. And as always, keep reading.